Hello. This lecture is going to cover the modern era. It corresponds with Chapter 19 in Understanding Art 11th edition. The learning objectives for this lecture include being able to describe the major features of artistic movements of the 18th and 19th centuries, including neoclassicism, romanticism, realism, impressionism, post-impressionism, expressionism, and Art Nouveau. Discuss works of art as examples of the typical qualities of each movement, and outline key qualities of artistic traditions in Africa, India, Japan, Oceania, and the Americas during the 19th century. So we are really just covering about 100 years in this lecture, and it's going to include a lot of different styles. So make sure that you are taking notes on the names of the styles and writing down some of those characteristics for each one and some of the major artists and artworks so that you can keep track of all of them, because there will be a lot, like we just mentioned. And this chapter in the textbook starts with a quote from artist Robert Motherwell. And his quote is, "Most painting in the European tradition was painting the mask. Modern art rejected all that. Our subject matter was the person behind the mask." So, when we talk about the word modern, I think that's important that you understand when we're referring to it with modern visual art in this class. The word modern itself just kind of means, of the present moment. But that's certainly not what we're talking about this week in this lecture, because we're looking at stuff from the 19th century, which is not of the present moment. So, when we talk about what modern art is, it really has to do with new subjects, new materials, and techniques that signaled changing from the past. And certainly that was something that happened in the Renaissance with the develop of linear perspective, but that does not make Renaissance artists modern artists. Just know that there was the representation of space through linear perspective in the Renaissance. And as we're moving into the modern era, there's going to be a change with how artists depict space. And so it's not so much using strict linear perspective anymore. It's going to be about a compression of space and how artists choose to depict space. And so this is very much the history of modern art is really the history of two differing perceptions and renderings of space. So we're going to be starting with neoclassicism, and that's going to be one flattening out of pictorial space, and then we'll be moving into romanticism. We will still have the survival of academic painting that's looking back to classicism. There's still going to be some of that in there, and a lot of the artwork that is happening now, it's essential that we consider the relationship between art, politics, what's happening in the social consciousness, because in the 19th century, there is a lot of change in all of those areas. And so realist artists are going to reject the Academy art, and it's going to continue with the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. And then, of course, when we have the invention of photography, that's going to dramatically change things as well. And also keep in mind that at this point, as we're moving into the 19th century, Paris is going to be the center of the art world. We've moved away from Rome as the center. Okay, so I mentioned we're starting with neoclassicism. Modern art declared its opposition to the whimsy of the late Rococo style with neoclassical art of the late 18th and early 19th century, so the end of the 1700s into the 1800s. Neoclassical art contained harsh sculptural lines, a subdued palette, planar instead of linear recession, and classical, especially Roman subject matter. So remember, we haven't totally left the classical stuff yet. And let's go through some examples so you can see how those characteristics are actually applied. So we're starting with a painting by Jacques-Louis David, and he was French. And it's important to understand that the subject matter of neoclassicism was directly inspired by the French Revolution. That's the people rising up against Louis the 16th, and he and that like kind of decadence and corruption. And so there was a rejection of all that kind of lifestyle and art. And so the neoclassical stands for, neo is new. So we have new classical art, and the Roman Empire was chosen as the kind of foundation for this style. So we are going to see a lot of things drawn from classical works of art. And this interest in the and classical art also corresponds with some archaeological discoveries that happened at this time period, including things like Pompeii, where lots of people were learning about ancient Rome. So remember with Rococo art, Rococo was all about like ornateness and frivolity, and neoclassical is a direct departure from that. So this painting, The Oath of the Horatii, David is depicting an event from Roman history in order to kind of inspire French patriotism and courage. So we have three brothers on the left side, and they are preparing to fight an enemy of Rome. They are swearing an oath to the empire by the kind of doing that with their arms while their father's holding up their swords. On the right hand side, you have the mother and some other relatives, and they are just they're a hot mess. They're weeping for the men's safety. They're very distraught. One of the enemy men is actually engaged to one of these sisters. So the Horatii, that's their family name, and one of the sisters of those brothers that are getting ready to fight is engaged to one of the enemies. So we have a family in conflict. So we have this classical story. We remember that that characters we talked about with classical art, the kind of balance of emotion and restraint. We've got it here again. So we've got the emotional women on the right hand side with the strength of the men on the other side. We've got a kind of a reduced palette, so we just have some flashes of red in here, kind of a general kind of dulled down palette in terms of the background, some blues and a lot of kind of earth tones, and you don't even really have a whole lot of like strong emotion on the faces. They're just kind of like their body language says some stuff, but like the faces of the men and the father are not overly emotional. So we do have, remember the little triangular composition we talked about? We've got that kind of form again, the top of the triangle being the points of the swords, and then the kind of triangle goes off in either direction. Same kind of thing with the way that Leonardo did the three windows in the Last Supper painting. This artist also has the center of the painting kind of being the focal point as well. And we've also got some classical architecture in there, which corresponds to the subject matter of the painting. And we don't have really that like necessarily like strong linear perspective in this. The space is a little bit flattened, where kind of everything is pushed up a little bit to the front, as we saw with some of more recent styles of painting, kind of like everything kind of right up there in your face, like with some of the Baroque artists. And one last thing that a textbook talks about, that David was an artist who highly supported the French Revolution, and then later in his career he actually made artwork for the coronation of Napoleon. So he kind of ended up kind of working for something that went against a lot of the French Revolution ideals, and he chose in the end to spend the last years of his life out of France as a response to that. Okay, we are going to look at Angelica Kauffman now. She was born originally in Switzerland and was educated in Rome, and she is another neoclassical painter who was working at the same time as David. And she's known for her portraiture, history painting, and some narrative works. This painting is called The Artist in the character of design, listening to the inspiration of poetry. So in classical mythology, there are the muses, and they are kind of like spiritual beings that give people ideas about things. So Angelica Kaufman actually did a self portrait as herself. She's the muse of design who is listening to the muse of poetry. So we have some classical architecture in here, right, with the columns in the background. We've got some drapery, like those sculptures that we've seen before. Faces are somewhat idealized, and we've got kind of that rich color palettes, some kind of pops of color like the red of the drapery in there. So once again, a good example of new classical architecture or painting with some architecture in it. Okay, we are going to look at Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and his style was very linear. So I'll show you a comparison with another artist in a little bit so you can kind of really understand what I mean when we say linear. But just in this painting, if you look at all the objects, they are very clearly delineated, right? Like you can see every edge of everything. It's all very kind of crisp and clean. And so this style is very linear, kind of sculptural smoothness. This painting is called Grand Odalisque, and it is supposed to be a Turkish harem in the tradition of the reclining Venuses that we've seen in the Venetian Renaissance. So remember Titian's Venus of Urbino. I'll bring it back in a little bit so you can kind of jog your memory. But in this case, this figure has a really long spine, kind of an exaggerated spine. Her limbs are kind of lengthened as well. So it's a little bit of a oddness of fullness of form that kind of brings us back to the Mannerist painting at the end of the Renaissance, where the kind of forms got distorted a little bit. And so this one, we have some different types of lines. Like if you look at the drapery in the background, the fabric on the bed that she's laying on. So we have really nice, smooth forms, somewhat of a muted palette. Space is kind of flattened a little bit in the sense that, you just have the subject pushed up towards the foreground, and we don't have a whole lot of background space. It doesn't go back into the background like the Titian painting did with the little handmaidens in the background or anything like that. We don't really have a background in this one. And so this type of exotic nude was pretty popular in the late 18th century. And this style was somewhat similar to some of the stuff that we saw in the Baroque era, with just like this kind of female nude painting. But we're going to kind of see some different approaches to it as we go a little bit forward. Okay, so now we're going to look at neoclassical sculpture. So neoclassicism was really embraced by artists in the United States, in England, in France, and this is the work of Antonio Canova. He was trained in Italy, and he became a sculptor to Napoleon in France and was responsible for a lot of portraits of the emperor and members of the emperor's family. This is Napoleon's sister, Pauline Borghese, and a lot of times Napoleon would choose a Zeus-like pose for his portraits by the artist Ingres, and Pauline had herself portrayed as the goddess of love, Venus. So you have the reclining figure, we're familiar with that, referencing classical Greek prototypes. And here we have a combination of realism and idealism. So we know that her face has got some individualization. It's supposed to be a portrait, but it's definitely improved upon, kind of idealized, to make her look, the best that she can look. And we're going to look a little bit at neoclassical architecture. So, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, neoclassicism really dominated architectural design in France, England, and America. A lot of the architects and visionaries in America, Thomas Jefferson included, really embraced classical models for how they wanted to build buildings. They thought they were like aesthetically beautiful and also simplicity. And remember that they're making references to ancient Greek because, especially in America, that was what we were basing our government on, the democracy aspect of it. So there was a direct kind of reference to where that came from in the ancient Greek times. So I've included Monticello here, which was Thomas Jefferson's residence, and he was the architect who designed it. And of course, you can see some of the classical elements in there with the columns and the pediment. And then Washington, D.C. itself, as a city, being the nation's capital, was also very neoclassically designed, from the plan of it with kind of radiating boulevards and geometric spaces, to Cass Gilbert's design for the Supreme Court building. Now, this was built in the 20th century, I will say, so we're not as far back as we have been with neoclassicism, but just showing you that this idea of referencing ancient Greece is very much on purpose. And so in the Supreme Court building, you have the columns that are both a combination of Ionic order and Corinthian order. And of course, you have the pediment up there with sculptural elements in it, just like the Pantheon. Okay, now we're moving into Romanticism. Both Neoclassicism and Romanticism reflected the revolutionary spirit of the times. While Neoclassicism emphasized restraint of emotion, purity of form, and subjects that inspired morality, Romantic artists often sought extremes of emotion, lots of brushwork, and brilliant palette. So brushwork meaning like you can kind of see how the paintbrush was going on the canvas, kind of this brushy look. And we're going to look at the first one by Theodore Géricault, and this is called The Raft of the Medusa. And this is a really good example of Romanticism because it captures a lot of emotion. It has some drama in it. So in some ways, there's some similarities there with Baroque art, but Romanticism absolutely kind of references the drama and things like this. And this painting is actually based on a true story. Géricault actually opposed the French monarchy, and this painting is trying to call attention to the mismanagement of the French government. And so the story is in this painting that this is a shipwreck, and it was based on a true story where the captain of this ship was kind of made the captain not because he was qualified, but because he was like a relative or a friend or something of the government, and so kind of it was nepotism essentially. And there was a shipwreck, and these are the people that are attempting to survive. They are, of course, you can see in the midst of a serious situation. People are kind of clinging to each other, trying to stay on this raft. So there's a lot of movement, really strong diagonal line that brings us up to the apex of the figure at the top right, kind of waving a scarf or a piece of fabric, trying to signal to a ship to rescue them. In real life, a lot of the people on this raft perished and even resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. It was very much a direct attack on the government for their mismanagement of the situation, and letting someone be the captain of a ship who shouldn't have been. So ultimately, though, when we look at this in terms of Romanticism, we see lots of drama. We see some, like the wind is blowing. We see, a lot of people kind of moving around, lots of action and drama. And that's some of the characteristics that we see in Romanticism. And now we're going to move over to Eugene Delacroix. And he was in the group that was similar to Rubens. And if you remember Rubens from our last lecture, he was all about kind of depicting really rosy kind of flesh tones. And you can see that in the way that Delacroix paints as well. So this is an example of the kind of brushwork that we were talking about with Romanticism. You can kind of see how he's painting the skin. It's not super smoothed over like some of the neoclassical painting was. So in this painting, we've got, once again, a lot of action happening, kind of a dramatic story. The composition is all very diagonal, kind of going from that bottom right corner up to the top left. This is the painting, The Death of Sardanapalus, was inspired by a tragedy written by Lord Byron, and it depicts the murder-suicide of an Assyrian king who, rather than surrender to his attackers, he set fire to himself and his entourage, which is a pretty dramatic event, a pretty dramatic situation. So you've got all of this guy's possessions in the room, including his concubines and servants, and his horses literally are all in the room. And pretty much this is going to turn into a big funeral pyre. So there's a lot of chaos happening. So there's chaos and terror. You can see people's, reactions on their face and their body movement. So we've got kind of that passion from the Baroque period kind of coming over here into Romanticism. And that is going to wrap it up for that painting. But I wanted just to come back to the kind of difference with neoclassical and Romanticism with the painter's style. So this is another one by Delacroix, and you can very much kind of see on the figure's body. This is an odalisque, that's a reclining nude painting, and you can see kind of the brushwork on her skin and on the fabric. It's very, there's no other way to say it. There's very brushy. And I just wanted to compare that with the Grand Odalisque that we looked at before. So that one with the neoclassical, very crisp lines, everything is very like perfectly smooth. And it's kind of almost like that trompe l'oeil like effect that you kind of tricking you. There's no acknowledgement that, there's, paint being applied to a canvas. Whereas with Delacroix's painting, you very much see that kind of that brushy look. So I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page with that style difference. Okay, and then we are going to look at Francisco Goya. And he is actually an artist from Spain, did not ever go to France, but his paintings were kind of foreshadowing the later 19th century Impressionist paintings. And he did go to Rome for a little bit for studying art, but he spent most of his life in Spain, and he had a good reputation there, and he was awarded a lot of commissions by the Spanish royalty. And some of his best known work, though, is work with some political overtones. And so this most famous one is the 3rd of May, 1808, and it commemorates a massacre of the peasant citizens of Madrid after the city fell to the French. And so some of the things that we might remember about Baroque art with the kind of spotlight effect, that tenebrism, where you kind of have a little spotlight shining on the scene. We see that in this particular case where you have a Spaniard who has his arms thrust out to the side, kind of in surrender, with the enemy who are holding their bayonets. We don't see their faces, but we kind of have that a lot of drama. We see, horror and fear and helplessness on the peasants' faces, and that kind of bright spotlight effect, of course, is highlighting that emotion. And showing us, once again with romanticism, drama, passion. There's someone who has already been shot on the ground. So those are all some of those characteristics of a romanticism that we're going to remember. And Goya devoted a lot of his life to representing man's inhumanity to other humans. And that was something that he did a lot of his work about. And so we're starting to move into some artwork that is having some, social commentary in it. And we'll see some more of that throughout the lecture today. So we have neoclassical art. Our artists we looked at, Ingres. His paintings really had a calm, exotic classicism. Delacroix brought up that Baroque kind of revival with dynamic, brushy work. And then we have Goya, who has almost paintings kind of in the spirit of revolution. And a lot of the art that was really affecting artists at the time was art from the Academy. So the style of art with the least impact on the development of modern art was the most popular type of painting in its day. Academic art derived its style and subject matter from the conventions established by the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture in Paris. I'm out of practice with my French. Established in 1648, the Academy maintained a firm grip on artistic production for more than 2 centuries. So remember, we mentioned this before, the idea that if you wanted to show your work in the Academy, you had to be a member of the Academy, which means you had to follow the rules of the Academy. And the kind of art that the Academy wanted was what you would paint or what you would sculpt if you wanted to be, accepted and shown and, be able to sell your work. So some of the artists at this time, they worked within the confines of a style that was acceptable to the Academy, but they tried to kind of break out in some little ways. So one of the most popular and accomplished academic painters was Adolphe William Bouguereau. And he has some historical paintings and some religious paintings, and all kind of in the classical style. So these kind of very meticulously painted nudes and mythological subjects. We're looking at a painting called Nymphs and Satyrs. So once again, going back to classical mythology, and we have some playfulness kind of, like in the way that they're kind of moving around. And this is something that might have appealed to the average everyday art patron. But we're starting to have artists who are interested in painting more, serious subjects, like the Raft of the Medusa. They're interested in maybe going a little more deep with their work. And that is what brings us to realism. So the modern painters of the 19th century objected to academic art because the subject matter didn't really represent real life, and because the manner in which the subjects were rendered did not reflect reality as it was observed by the naked eye. So things, kind of idealized. Realist artists chose to depict subjects that were evident in everyday life using an optical approach rather than a conceptual approach to rendering subjects. So these artists were really interested in painting things the way they really looked from direct observation. Maybe, people with wrinkles, people, depicted as they truly were rather than idealizing everything. So first we're going to look at Honoré Daumier, and he was one of the artists who was most concerned with bringing to light the very real subject of the plight of the masses. He worked as a caricaturist for Parisian journals, so magazines or newspapers, and a lot of times he used them to ridicule the bourgeois society and the monarchy. He even ridiculed King Louis Philippe, and it landed him in jail for 6 months. But this is one of his paintings, and it's called The Third Class Carriage. And He has some things that kind of help us to see a little bit of that kind of caricaturist style. You can see some of the line work kind of drawing out some of the details. Sometimes people's features are a little bit exaggerated. So we've got peasants that are crowded in this car. Their clothing is kind of rumpled and, clearly not super well, made clothing. Their faces are kind of expressionless. And then we see the kind of a more upper class, the bourgeois people on the other side of the little barrier, the seat with their little top hat. And so you can kind of see this like physical barrier between them, and then the kind of the barrier of maybe class with the clothing and things like that in there. Okay, we're gonna move on to Courbet. Okay, so we have Gustave Courbet in here, and he's considered to be the father of the realist movement. And just want to make sure we understand, like, now we're talking about realism with the capital R. At the very beginning of the semester, when we talked about styles and we talked about depicting things realistically, I tried to make sure we emphasize that that's, lowercase r. You can also interchange that with the style naturalism, things depicted as they look in real life, green on a tree, sky being blue, that kind of thing, because realism with a capital R is this style that we are talking about. It refers to this 19th century style. And so we have this painting called The Stonebreakers. And actually, it was not very popular with contemporary critics because, of course, they were interested in things like mythological subjects or things that had been idealized. And here we have an older man and a young boy breaking stones on the roadside. This is not a historical painting. People are not idealized. This is not making any sort of reference to classical mythology. We've got real people doing real work. So the subject matter was criticized, and also just the style in which he painted. So it's not this kind of glossy finish of the academic painting. It's a lot of muted tones, a lot of earth tones, as it probably would have been in real life had we've seen these people on the side of the road breaking stones. So whereas academic painters are trying to paint these exact representations of figures that are idealized, Courbet was often he would kind of jot down his ideas in a little sketch, and then he would go back and paint it. And the idea is that he's really trying to show real world people doing real world activities, not worrying about so much whether or not it was this like clean and polished, perfection version. Okay, so while Courbet may have been laying the groundwork for the next style we're talking about, which is Impressionism, he was not really a new wave in the sense of like being really on the avant garde. He was still, in some ways, kind of conservative. And he actually would express some disapproval of some of the younger generation's painting techniques. And one of the people he criticized was this artist, Edward Manet. And according to some art historians, Manet is pretty much responsible for changing the course of the history of painting. What was really one of the first things about Manet was his painting technique. So since the Renaissance, artists were starting with like a dark underpainting, and they would build it up to bring out bright highlights. And Manet would actually start with a white surface and then build up dark tones. So the textbook talks about this approach lent a greater luminosity to his work. And so it allowed for a little bit better reproduction of natural light. And he also didn't really model his figures with the way that we were like the traditional chiaroscuro, trying to do these subtle changes of value to show light and shadow to make them look three-dimensional. So his pigments are kind of flatly applied, and so things kind of look a little flatter. So he's kind of collapsing space a little bit and flattening things out. And of course, critics and public were not fans. They found it to be a little uh, abrasive. And one of his most shocking paintings is the one that we are looking at, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, but which is Luncheon on the Grass. And this is a pivotal work. And we have Manet's lunch taking place in this little woodland setting. You have some French middle class people. We have a little bit of a tradition of Renaissance pastoral scenes. There are some paintings of this from the Renaissance period, not this exact scene, but the idea of people out in a meadow or out in the woods kind of doing a thing. And so we've got that pyramidal composition that we've been seeing since the Renaissance time. And this painting is actually based on a Renaissance engraving called The Judgment of Paris. The composition is based on that, and Edward Manet has kind of replaced the characters and replaced the subject. So what was so alarming is that there's not really any explanation for what's going on. Why are the men clothed and the women mostly unclothed? The one in the foreground is completely nude. The one back in the water has a little bit of a drapery. The men are kind of chatting there, seemingly like ignoring the women. We have the it's there's a lot of mysterious stuff happening, and this painting is quite large. It's 7 feet by 8 feet, so it's kind of real big in your face there. And the other thing that was kind of shocking was that the woman meets the viewer's stare. So in a way that we've seen a lot of these reclining nudes, it's kind of there for the spectator's gaze. Often the male gaze is assumed, and here we have the woman kind of meeting our gaze very boldly. So whereas people might have, being expecting something from the academy, right? Like the nymphs and the satyrs, people frolicking around in the woods, and it's all, mythological characters. Here we've got real people. The portraits are based on actual people that Manet knew, and so there was a lot of a lot of things that people were shocked by with this painting. Manet submitted the work to the 1863 Salon, which was the art show for the Academy, and surprisingly, not, it was rejected. So he and other artists' work who were rejected got so up in arms about it that Napoleon III allowed them to exhibit their work in what was known as the Salon des Refusés, which is the Salon of the Rejected Painters. And this was actually one of the most important gatherings of avant-garde painters in the century, because it was all the people who were challenging the traditional styles and were essentially ushering in the next the next wave of art. And so Manet was artistically, he was challenging, but he wasn't trying to be a rebel and not be successful. So he did do some private commissions and things like that that allowed him to make a living. And so he did influence the Impressionists a lot. And so we will be moving into their style here very soon. I have one more Manet painting that I want to show you, but before we go to that, I just want to show you once again the Venus of Urbino by Titian, because this painting really was an important painting for artists as a departure point in terms of reinterpreting it with regard to the reclining nude. So Titian's painting was commissioned by the Duke of Urbino for his private quarters. And I mentioned before there was a market for erotic paintings in the 16th centuries that the idea of the great nudes of Western art are essentially, created for the same purpose as a pinup that we think of for gazing upon. And this one by Titian is important in the canon of art. Also, just because other artists have said, okay, now I'm going to reinterpret it. So that is what Manet did with his Olympia painting. So this is one of the first departures from the Titian Venus, and in this one, Manet is intentionally mimicking the Renaissance composition as a way to challenge the notion that modern art lacked credibility when it came, to comparing them with the old masters. So, Manet is kind of saying like, oh, you want a Venus? I will give you a Venus. So where do you find a Venus in the 19th century in Paris? At a bordello in Paris. And so we have some of the same things. We have a maid servant. We've got the reclining nude there. We've got her meeting our gaze, just like the Titian one did, but it's kind of brought into the 19th century and still kind of serving that same idea of a reclining nude. As we're moving into Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, we'll talk about Paul Gauguin. He was a 19th century French painter who moved to Tahiti and also was inspired by that tradition of the Western reclining nude when he created this, The Noble Woman. And so he's familiar with Manet's revision because they were contemporaries, and we know that they would have known about each other. But for this one, all three of these that we've looked at so far, they have this sense of self-display. When we think about these paintings, we can think about, is the woman soliciting our gaze? Is she, refusing our gaze? How do the stylistic differences influence our interpretation of them and our relationship to them? How did the artist choose to depict the female body and the backgrounds that we're all in? And this brings up something that is talked a lot about in contemporary art criticism with the gaze. Is this meant for a male gaze? Is it for a female gaze? Is it for both? And so we'll look at one more that kind of presents like a new version. This last painting that I'm just going to show you is by Suzanne Valadon. She was a 20th century painter, also French, but she is once again presenting us with a different view, this time with a reclining female, just not so much nude. And this is one that maybe presents that counterpoint that the painting of these reclining nudes is not really in the interest of women artists, and that she's presenting a different version that, when women want to relax, they really don't look like that Venus that Titian painted or the one that Manet or Gauguin painted, but instead, we put on our comfy pants and have a book on, on the bed with us and maybe do some relaxing activities. Like in this one, the woman is having a cigarette. So as we move forward, we will continue to see artists challenging these kind of traditional things like the reclining nude and giving us some alternative perspectives. Rosa Bonheur was one of the most successful artists working in the second half of the 19th century. She is related to Courbet and the other realist painters in terms of her style, but she actually avoided human subjects and really stuck to painting animals.
both domesticated and wild animals. She was really interested in getting close to her subjects, so she would wear men's clothing. A lot of times she would wear pants and boots, which was kind of new for this time. And she would actually go out to slaughterhouses and other places where she could get close to animals in order to be able to study them. So the painting we're looking at, the horse fair, is kind of a panoramic scene. We've got lots of action. We've seen a lot of movement around with the horses rearing. So she's clearly trying to depict animals in their natural state, just in terms of their movement and how they move around. You have some dramatic light and dark with the colors of the horses and the light source kind of shining down from that right side. And so we see a little bit of a struggle between man and beast, essentially, with the horses and the humans kind of trying to rear them in. And so we got a lot of energy in here. It was a very popular work, so it was bought and engraved in reproduction so that people could own it, a version of it. Rosa Bonheur actually was accepted by the Academy and, like I mentioned, was successful. There were some younger artists banding together in France to rebel against the French art establishment. And those artists were the Impressionists. They weren't called that at the time, but eventually they would be called that. And while many of them had struggled to get commissions and were not necessarily successful at the beginning of their careers, they ended up being some of the most significant and widely loved in the history of Western art. The Impressionist artists reacted against the constraints of academic style and subject matter. They advocated painting outdoors, en plein air, as it is in French, and chose to render subjects found in nature. They studied the dramatic effects of atmosphere and light on people and objects. Using a varied palette of colors, they captured the actual colors, or local colors, of objects under different lighting conditions. Impressionist painters juxtaposed complementary colors to reproduce the optical vibrations of looking at objects in full sunlight, and primary colors to produce, in the eye of the spectator, secondary colors. The term Impressionist comes from a critic who saw this painting by Claude Monet and was criticizing it. Claude Monet titled this painting Impression Sunrise, and the idea with this is to give you the idea of a sunrise. He's not giving you every single detail crisp and clean, because you don't necessarily need that to understand what you're seeing. And this is a good example, too, of abstraction in art. When artists simplify things, they leave out some details, but you don't necessarily need them to recognize things. For example, in the center of the picture playing towards the foreground, we see a little boat with some figures in it. Hopefully you would have recognized that as a boat with some figures in it. You don't need all the individual grains of the wood painted in order to understand that. We get the idea. And what Claude Monet was interested in was how the light from the sun would affect the way the water looked and the impression that you would get from it for this fleeting moment, because we know, especially at sunrise, what the way that something looks might dramatically change in 3, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, as the sun continues to rise. So when this was shown and the critic was criticizing it and saying, like, it's just like some sort of impression. This is not like a finished painting, that was owned by Claude Monet and many of his contemporaries as like, oh, that's like actually exactly what we're going for. And they kind of owned that term. Monet is one of the artists who really focused on the effects of light on his subjects, and he was known for going to the same place and painting the same subject multiple times, depending on the conditions, maybe very early in the day, maybe halfway through the day, towards the evening, in the summertime, in the wintertime. And he was interested in seeing how that affected the way the colors on the building might look, or the people, or whatever. So he has many kind of sets of paintings where he's painted this. This one in particular is called Rouen Cathedral. And he did this one as well several times to, varying angles, very seasons, times of day, things like that, so that he could kind of create this single moment in time, right? This impression. You don't need every single little carved stone painted to get the idea that, the bright sunlight is shining on this cathedral. Most Impressionist artists did landscape scenes and also painted members of the middle class. And they did a lot of leisure time activity paintings. So Pierre Auguste Renoir was known a lot for his paintings of people. This particular one, Le Moulin de la Galette, shows a lot of people at an outdoor space gathering, enjoying drinks, conversation, dancing. And so he is giving that impression of a big group of people, lots of movement, but also we are also tapping into that light, how light is shining through the trees. And, we see like these little glimmers on people's faces and things like that. So we have that interest in how light affects the subject matter. We've got this little impression of a moment in time, and we've got just every the event happening with like the spirit of just the happiness and people doing what they do on an everyday basis. Now we're going to look at Berthe Morisot. She was an artist who exhibited with the Salon early in her career, but then kind of gave up that safe path as a way to explore her true interests in painting. Morisot was actually the granddaughter of the 18th century painter Jean-Honoré Fragonard, the Rococo painter that I showed you with the swing. She's a granddaughter of his, and she was married to Edouard Manet's brother. So she was the sister-in-law of Manet, and Manet painted her. Sometimes she appears in some of his paintings. In this painting, Young Girl by the Window, we have a really good characteristic of Impressionism with the fact that you can literally see where her paintbrush has just wiped paint on the canvas. We see the very loose brush strokes, almost, they appear to be applied kind of frantically and randomly, but they're not. They're very specifically placed. But the idea is we have more detail in the areas that she's really trying to show you, the woman's face. And once again, it's this idea, an impression of a woman sitting in a chair. And we don't need every single detail of her dress. We don't need every single detail of what's going on in the background. The idea is we just have the overall impression, the overall idea, with that loose brushwork of, a patterned wallpaper in the background. Now we're going to look at the work of Edgar Degas, and his approach to painting was a little bit different from those of his peers. Degas was like Morisot in that he exhibited at the Salon for years before kind of breaking away and joining the Impressionist movement. He studied under Ingres, who was that French artist that we talked about earlier, and he went to Italy and copied the Renaissance masters. He was also really interested in Japanese prints and photography. The Impressionists were really influenced by Japanese woodcuts. That was something I showed in the end of the last lecture with Mary Cassatt's kind of influence from the Japanese woodcut prints. And Japanese woodcut prints were being available in Europe, and so a lot of regular everyday people saw them. A lot of artists saw them, and they were really interested in the way that the Japanese arranged their spatial organization and how line could direct the viewer's eyes to different sections of the work and kind of divided areas of flattened space. They really liked the patterning and the flat forms in those woodcuts. And so we're going to see that showing up some more in some of the Impressionists' work and the post-Impressionist period as well. Degas was also really influenced by photography, which of course was being invented at this time, and the idea of how you frame the composition. So this painting, The Rehearsal, contains some elements of photography and Japanese prints. So we have kind of an off-center space with the curving of the staircase, and then it's kind of like we're not, as the viewer, we're not centered on the room. We're kind of like over in the corner a little bit. So we've got this kind of unusual perspective of just what's going on in the room. So we've got some diagonals that guide our eye up through the composition, up into that top right corner, and we've got lots of diagonals by the women's arms kind of pointing in that same direction. And the way that Degas has framed this, there are things kind of just chopped off at the sides, right? Like the female form on the far right hand, we don't, like, her face is just, cropped. And same with over on the left side, you can see some of the dancers, they're just cropped off. And this is very much relates to how photography works. When you hold up your nowadays smartphone, or back then when you hold, when you have the camera, the frame, sometimes things just get cropped. And so this really reinforces that idea of that impression, right? It's almost as if we just happen to have like walked in this room just briefly. We're at eye level with all of them, and it's kind of, like, oh, this quick impression of a dance rehearsal happening right here in front of us. And now we're moving into post-impressionism. The post-impressionists of the late 19th century were drawn together by their rebellion against what they considered the impressionists' exclusive or excessive concern for fleeting impressions and a disregard for traditional composition elements. Post-impressionists fell into two groups that parallel the stylistic polarities of the Baroque and the neoclassical/romantic periods. The works of Georges Seurat and Paul Cézanne maintained a more systematic approach to compositional structure, brushwork, and color, and the works of Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin coordinated line and color with symbolism and emotion. So when we get started with post-impression, we're going to start with Georges Seurat, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. So we have some similarities with Impressionism in the sense that we have middle-class people doing everyday activities, enjoying an outdoor activity. It kind of looks like Impressionism that's been kind of tightened up a little bit, where we have these smaller brushstrokes. And so it is a subject matter that's similar to Impressionism. However, this is not so much the spontaneous painting found in Impressionism, but more a tightly controlled scientific approach to painting. Seurat's technique is called pointillism, and he applied the paint in really small dabs or points of pure color. And he was really interested in color theory and how the human eye perceives color, and when you put two colors next to each other very closely, how it can form a third color. So he was reading about color theory by scientists and using these theories to kind of approach painting in a more intellectual way, with putting these little dots of vibrant hues, putting complementary colors next to each other and primary colors side by side. And so as the way that the human eye kind of blends them together. Just a side note, if you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there's a scene where they go see this painting at the Art Institute of Chicago, and it shows Cameron looking at it, and it kind of zooms in closer and closer and closer. And so you can see the individual little dots, which I'm sure also you could probably Google a detail of this painting and see how it is, all these little individual dots. From the time of Manet, there was a movement away from realistic representations to more abstraction. We've been seeing that in several examples, and Cézanne is going to continue that. Paul Cézanne was a post-impressionist who had an intellectual approach to painting like Seurat, but he is known for having led a revolution of abstraction. Now, this may not look extremely abstract to you, and it's not particularly, but he's kind of credited with like taking the first steps forward, really heading in that direction. So he did not completely depart from the old masters. He was somewhat aligned with the Impressionists with their color palette and their subject matter. He also took things from the old masters, and he was interested and really trying to take what the Impressionists were doing and kind of like make it acceptable to the to the canon and get it to something like art in the museum. So he is known for his structural use of color and brushwork, and I'll try to kind of really explain that with the still life painting that we are looking at. So in this painting, we have all of these fruits arranged on this table. And one of the things that Cezanne is known for is his attempt to break everything down into these basic geometric forms. So cylinders, spheres, rectangular prisms, things like that. And you can kind of see that in his approach to painting these fruits, is just like really looking at things as a geometric form. Even the cloth, that white cloth that's kind of arranged, he's not super worried about having a strong perspective. For example, if you kind of look at the edges of the table, like in terms of that going across horizontally, they don't line up exactly. Like if you start over on the left, that back edge of the table, like it jumps up by the time we get over to the right. So he's not too particularly worried about a specific vantage point. It's kind of almost like we've kind of moved around a little bit as we're looking at this painting. But it's a very cohesive painting. It's all, very complete. I often use Cezanne as an example of unity, just in the way that he's very conscious of repeating colors throughout his paintings and repeating them, and they look very unified. And he's got also a style where he brings in some darker outlines. If you look at the edges of the fruit, some of them are almost outlined with black, which certainly is not exactly how the real world looks. We don't have objects outlined in black as to show their edges. So we have this strong move in the direction of moving towards abstraction, kind of flattening the space and breaking things down into basic geometric forms, and even going as far as outlining things with some dark lines. And now we're going to move on to talking about Vincent van Gogh, who is one of the most tragic and best known figures in art history. He was a Dutch post-impressionist artist. We sometimes think of him because of some of the more dramatic events of his life, such as when he cut off part of his ear and his apparent suicide. And the textbook actually has a section where it talks about why he might have done this act with his ear. And I'm actually not going to go into that, because I don't think that that's anything that we really need to spend a lot of time examining. I think, discussing people's mental health more than their artwork is probably not giving him his just recognition. One of the amazing things about Vincent van Gogh is that he became an artist later in his life. He came from parents, his father was a minister, and his brother went into the art world as an art dealer, and that was something that believe his uncle was involved with. So Vincent eventually kind of tried his hand at that, just becoming someone who sold artwork, and also did not do very well with that. So he was only an artist for about 10 years, and most of his artwork that he made during that brief period was created in the last a little bit over 2 years of his life. And he started painting in a very dark manner. Some of his early work, if you look at his color palette, it's very dark. He was painting a lot of peasants and people who were in the lower class. And then he went to Paris to study a little bit, and eventually went to Arles, which is a warmer, temperate area in France. And that's where he painted a lot of his most well-known works. We do know that he had issues with mental illness. He was hospitalized in an asylum, and that is actually where he painted his most famous work, The Starry Night. So this is just in a sense a landscape painting. We have a little sleepy town at nighttime with the swirling sky around, with the repeated little brushstrokes that Vincent van Gogh is very known for, with kind of the vibrations in the sky and in the light. He has that really characteristic little brushstroke application of paint, and he was really interested in kind of the blending of colors, as we've seen from some of the other post-impressionist artists, kind of just like the layering of colors. And we're definitely seeing a little bit move towards abstraction with this similarity with Cézanne's work, with the kind of the outlines of things. Van Gogh's paintings often have some dark outlines around objects as well. And certainly Starry Night, one of the most iconic paintings in Western history. So many of you mentioned it in the beginning of the semester with an artwork that you really love, or that you is possibly your favorite. This is actually at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. I would encourage you, if you're ever in New York City, go see it. I will forever remember the first time I saw it in real life. I was going into the gallery. I didn't even know it was in that room. And I kind of walked in and I saw it, and I was like, oh, I remember in my brain, my head just went like, oh, there you are. It was a very emotional moment for me. Van Gogh has always been one of my favorite artists. And I definitely got a little teary-eyed and just was like, oh my gosh, here it is. I've seen it on t-shirts and mugs and everywhere, but here's the real one. And I would encourage you, if you do love Van Gogh, or you like art in general, there's an amazing film called Loving Vincent that was made not too terribly long ago, but it was made by an artist, and she really loves Van Gogh as well. But the entire film was painted with oil paint, and it's a really magnificent film in terms of like how it was made, but also the story it tells. And it's kind of, it takes place after Van Gogh's death, but it kind of investigates maybe like the end of his life, and how he was doing mentally. It's a lot about just mental health, and remembering that people create amazing and beautiful things, regardless of maybe how people are treating them because of their mental health. And it's an amazing film. I love it. I would really encourage you, if you need something to watch maybe over Thanksgiving break, or your holiday break, Loving Vincent is definitely something I recommend. Okay, and we are going to get back to Paul Gauguin. I showed you a painting earlier by him. Paul Gauguin is connected to Vincent van Gogh because Van Gogh, when he moved to Arles, he had this dream of creating an artist commune. He wanted to have artists all come together and live together and work together and just really create a little like art community, which is it's a great idea. Paul Gauguin was the only artist who initially agreed to do it, and he and Van Gogh lived together for a little while, and then it ended abruptly. It was not a good relationship. I'm sure there were there were issues on both ends, but Paul Gauguin had um, a connection to Vincent van Gogh in that sense. Gauguin actually started off as a stockbroker and then kind of just painted on the weekends. And then at age 35, he devoted himself full time to his art. He essentially left his wife and his 5 children to just become an artist. And I'll let you decide whether or not that was a responsible choice. But he identified early with the Impressionists, kind of adopting some of their techniques and participating in some of their exhibits. But he was a very restless soul, and he left France for Panama and Martinique and lived in Tahiti for part of his life. He was essentially trying to kind of get away from civilization, and he was trying to um, kind of get back to maybe the essence of humanity. And he developed a theory of art called synestheticism. Excuse me, I'm having trouble saying it. In which he advocated for the use of broad areas of unnaturalistic color and using symbolic subject matter. So this painting is called Vision After the Sermon, Jacob Wrestling with an Angel. And it's one of the first canvases where he's kind of applying this theory. So it combines reality with symbolism. So he heard a subject about this, so a group of women, they're Breton women, they're from France, and they heard a sermon on this subject matter, and they believed that they had a vision of Jacob, who is an ancestor of the Hebrews, wrestling with an angel. And so Gauguin is kind of bringing all that into his canvas. So he's got the details of the event, both actual and symbolic. There's an animal on the upper left-hand corner that kind of walks near a tree. We've got these really bright colors with the field and the red background. The Bible stories talks about Jacob wrestling with an angel on the banks of a river, and so they believe that these women were having a very strong religious experience, and they may have imagined this event happening that they say that they saw. Overall, kind of an unusual subject matter for a painting. But when we see in terms of just like artistic style, we've got these bright complementary colors, right? They're green, opposite of red, right next to each other, kind of a strong contrast. And so Gauguin is exaggerating some of his lines and patterns, and we have some flattening of space. And these were all of the things that we've been kind of talking about with post-impressionist art. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, along with Van Gogh, is one of the well-known artists of the 19th century. He's known for both his art and his personal life. He's actually born into a noble family, and he broke his legs when he was a teenager, and they failed to continue to grow and develop correctly. So he had a bit of a physical deformation, and actually his family kind of rejected him for it because he didn't look, I guess, quote unquote, normal. And so he turned to painting and lived in Paris, and for part of his time lived in a brothel. He kind of took up with the social outcasts, and used his art to portray the nightlife, the cafes, theaters, bordellos of Paris. And he did a lot of poster work. He's known for a lot of his advertisements of cabaret acts, and he did a lot of paintings of nightlife in France, in Paris. This is at the Moulin Rouge. And this is one of his paintings. And we see some influences of Japanese art from kind of this oblique perspective, right? We're kind of standing over on the side and kind of looking into the room kind of sideways. And we've got some kind of like, it's almost like a little snapshot, right? Like the way Degas cropped things, the woman's face on the far right. I mean, it's literally just kind of crops off. So we've got that influence of Japanese art and photography again. We've got some, very brushy brushwork in the background, kind of showing the mirrors, and we've got some unusual colors. Some of that stuff that's similar to Gauguin, with the fact that the woman's face has this kind of greenish light shining on it, and we've got some strong outlines again. You can see some of the figures in the background have those strong dark outlines. The edge of the kind of the bar has that long reddish outline on it. So those are all some of those characteristics of post-impressionism that we're seeing. And last little thing, Toulouse-Lautrec also included himself in this painting. He's not the right in the center, but if you look at the man on the top portion of the painting with the top hat, Toulouse-Lautrec kind of overlaps him just a little bit. So like look just down from here, and you'll see a man with a hat and a little beard on his face, and he's looking towards the left side of the painting. That is a self-portrait of Toulouse-Lautrec. So he's including himself in this painting. He was, someone who was accepted into this kind of nightlife environment, and much like some of the other artists we've mentioned, did not have a long life. He passed away when he was only 37. A polarity existed in post-impressionism that was like the polarity of the neoclassical romantic period. On one hand were artists who sought a more scientific approach to painting, like Seurat, and on the other hand were artists whose works were more emotional, expressive, and laden with symbolism, as exemplified by Van Gogh and Gauguin. In their vibrant palettes and bravura brushwork, Van Gogh and Gauguin foreshadowed expressionism. And here is a painting that you have probably seen before as well. So this is the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, and he studied French artists in Paris. So a lot of his early work looks more impressionistic, and then he abandoned the kind of lively subject matter and light colors to favor a little bit more somber style that reflected his preoccupation with fear and death. And The Scream is his best known work. It's one of the most recognizable paintings in Western art, I believe. And it portrays pain and isolation that was part of his kind of central themes that he wrote about. And he did actually write a little bit about this as an experience that he had, where he was walking in nature and felt that all of nature was kind of uttering this scream. So we have this figure who's walking across a bridge towards the viewer, cupping his ears and has a mouth open. So if you read what Munch wrote, it's not so much the figure screaming, it's that he felt that all of nature and the world was kind of uttering this scream. And so I think maybe the figure is actually reacting to that. We've got a couple of figures in the background going in the opposite direction, kind of unaware of what's going on. But we've got this landscape that maybe kind of helps to express that feeling. So we've got some line work that's similar to how Van Gogh did the sky, with kind of these very clearly delineated lines made by the paint. And we've got some bright kind of unnatural colors that we saw with Gauguin's style. And so this painting is certainly more emotional. It's kind of expressing some intensity and horror. And the textbook talks about how Munch has his view that humanity is being consumed by an increasingly dehumanized society. Okay, now we are going to look at the work of Käthe Kollwitz. And she is an artist who was German. And a lot of her work reflects ideas of loss, and that has a direct connection to her personal life. She lost a son in World War I and one of her grandsons in World War II. And a lot of her work reflects some sense of loneliness and inhumanity, injustice, humankind's destruction of itself. This particular work that we are looking at is an etching. So it's a print, and it's one of a series of 7 prints that she did representing the 16th century Peasants' War. So she's depicting something from history. And so in this print, there's the figure known as Black Anna was a woman who led laborers in their struggle against their oppressors. And she is kind of inciting she's riling people up. She's getting the peasants to go back to action. So we only see the back of her. She's got her head kind of bent down and her arms are raised up. You can just kind of imagine the kind of things that she's maybe yelling to get people to like rile up, and the peasants are rushing forward. And so this does record a specific historical incident. It's among some of that art from the realist movement of showing everyday people, not necessarily doing everyday activities, but certainly the real humans, right? These are people who are striving for freedom, and some of her other work is a little bit more emotional in a personal sense. She depicts mothers holding children, kind of really communicating that sense of loss that a mother might feel if her child dies of sickness or as a result of the inhumane things that humans can do to each other. And that was something that certainly in World War I became very apparent to people, particularly in Europe, who were living through it, and in World War II. There was a lot of artwork that tried to, kind of make sense of that, of the things that they were seeing in their world through those wars. Okay, so until the 20th century, art in the United States remained fairly provincial, which means not, like rebellious or out of the ordinary, or particularly, like new and avant-garde. Striving artists of the 18th and 19th centuries would go abroad for extended pilgrimages to study the old masters and to mingle with the avant-garde. So essentially, if you lived in America and you wanted to be a successful artist, you had to go to Europe for a period of time or for a long time. And in some cases, they immigrated to Europe permanently. These artists, among them are Mary Cassatt and James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and we're going to call them American expatriates. So here we have Mary Cassatt, and she came up before a little bit with Japanese art. She was an American born in Pittsburgh, but she spent most of her life in France. She was part of the Impressionist crew. Artists like Manet and Degas were influences on her. She was influenced by photography, Japanese art. And because she was a woman and she had limited access to places like the nightlife, maybe cafes and things like that, women of middle class stature were not expected to be going out at night to cafes and the cabarets, because that was not something for a respectable middle class woman to do. So artists like Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot, they had limited contact with, certain subject matters. So a lot of their work reflects, the kind of things that a middle class woman in Paris would be doing, such as going on a boat with your children. So a lot of their subject matter shows women, mothers, children, the kind of, access that they had, sitting at home doing things like that. So in this painting, we've got the boating party. So a mother and her child being rowed by a man. This is probably not her husband. He's like the guy who rows the boat. You pay him to row your boat for you. And so we've got some flat planes of color, some like just broad areas of flat color. We've got some bold lines and just broad shapes. So we've got some of that interest in Japanese art. She was very influenced by Japanese art as well. And we'll kind of see some other examples of that here a little bit later. And so, like I mentioned, a lot of her subject matter, mothers, women, children, kind of at home, because that's the kind of stuff that she had access to as a female. So at the same year that Monet painted that Impressionism sunrise painting that kind of launched Impressionism, this American artist, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, painted this painting. And it's often just referred to as Whistler's mother. But the title is actually called Arrangement in Black and Gray, The Artist's Mother. So it's a realistic painting. It has some influences from Courbet, from that capital R realism movement, as well as some influence of Japanese art. So he's got this kind of very in profile view of his mother silhouetted against this backdrop that's pretty kind of simple. We've got the strong contours of her dress balanced by this drapery over on the left side that's got a little bit of patterning on it. It's if we think about breaking it down into just basic shapes, we've got some, very basic geometric shapes, and then she's this large organic shape. So this idea of kind of breaking things down that we've been looking at with Cezanne, it's not even so much about the emotional portrait of his mother as it is kind of just a composition of pleasing shapes. While Whistler and Cassatt were working in Europe, several American artists of note remained at home working in the realist tradition. This realism appears in figurative painting and landscape painting, both of which were also tinted with Romanticism. Thomas Eakins was an important portrait painter of the 19th century. His early artistic training took place in the United States, and he did study in Paris with people who mostly depicted historical events. And so that was a big influence on him. So we have this work that we're looking at called The Gross Clinic, and it doesn't mean gross like as in, ooh, that's gross. Even though they are doing some sort of, medical situation. It's more the person's name is Dr. Samuel Gross. Because he was a surgeon. And this is a depiction of an operation on a young boy at the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. This is a great old window into what medical school used to be like. And Thomas Eakins was really interested in human anatomy, and he did work from live models and actual corpses, like learning what the human body, like how it was constructed, similar to the way actually Leonardo da Vinci did back in the Renaissance. And he was so dedicated to these practices that eventually he was forced to resign from a teaching post because of his strong commitment to studying the human form in all ways, inside and out. So this painting really shows the surgical procedures of the 19th century. You have Dr. Gross holding a bloody scalpel while kind of talking to his students. You've got The medical students in the background, kind of observing. You've got some of those who are helping out right up there in the foreground. We've got that kind of spotlight effect, kind of highlighting the main action. And of course, please notice over towards the left side of the painting, you've got the lone female figure just kind of covering her eyes. She's so shocked, and she's the boy's mother, and she's kind of sitting there, shielding her eyes, white knuckled, which certainly is something that maybe a parent of a child being operated on would actually be doing, but it maybe has uh, some feminist tones in terms of the men can handle it, the women cannot. But you have a pretty shockingly realistic depiction. It was rejected by the jury for exhibition. Because maybe of its kind of such realistic depiction. So he's close to Courbet in that sense of reality, the way that he's got some dramatic lighting kind of takes us all the way back to some of the Renaissance and Baroque artists with the drama being highlighted by that spotlight effect. So Eakins pretty much devoted his career to increasingly realistic portraits. A lot of times, some of the people that he actually painted were a little bit more were a little disappointed in how realistically he painted them. They were maybe hoping for a little bit more flattering depictions. His passion for realism actually led him to use photography to a point. And so his style and ideas influenced American artists of the early 20th century who also were working in that realist with a capital R vein. And also during the 19th century, American artists turned from the tradition of portraiture painting to landscape painting. And they were inspired by French landscape painting of the Baroque period. A lot of these artists were kind of fusing the pride and the beauty of their native United States with a romantic vision. And Thomas Cole was an artist who was born in England and immigrated to the United States at about age 17. He was always fond of landscape painting. He lived in New York, and there was an audience for this genre. Cole became the leader of what's called the Hudson River School, and that was a group of artists whose favorite subjects included the Hudson River and the Hudson River Valley. So this was in the Catskill Mountains of New York State. And this painting is called the Oxbow, and it refers to this natural oxbow formation in the Connecticut River Valley. So essentially, over time, rivers move a little bit over time as the water flows and erodes certain areas, and it can create these large kind of loop shapes. And eventually, it erodes so much that it will actually kind of like break off and just kind of continue at the points of the oxbow. But we've got this kind of vast sun-drenched space with a lot of very carefully painted details, right? That almost kind of reminds us a little bit of the Northern Renaissance artists with their attention to all these teeny tiny little details. So we've got some contrasting kind of stuff happening in the landscape. Over on the right side, we've got very sunny areas. Kind of the land is very like peaceful, and then over towards the left side, we've got some overcasting, some darker clouds, kind of the idea of some rain moving in, and then we have these kind of gnarled and twisty trees, and so we've got kind of a very up close view of the earth, kind of those trees that are right close to us up in the foreground. And then it goes way back into the distance, like way, way far off into the background with some of that atmospheric perspective that we've talked about, things kind of getting blurry and light colored. And this is a little bit of a statement with, like the human's nature, human's relationship to nature. There is actually one tiny little human. If you look in the foreground, the closest part to us, you'll see some little It's actually a depiction of Thomas Cole and his easel, so he's including himself in this big landscape scene. And we're going to wrap up this Americans section with a quilt by Harriet Powers. One note I just wanted to make was during this time, there were some African American artists working in the United States, and some of them found more success by going to Europe. So there were some American expatriates living and working in Europe because they got more acceptance there. Henry Ossawa Tanner was an example of an artist who was American and ended up living most of his life in Europe because he was accepted more as an artist. And it was something that still artists of this time, if they were African Americans, they were limited to the types of subject matter they could depict, and certainly the audience that would commission work by them. This is a quilt by Harriet Powers, and Harriet Powers was actually born in Athens, Georgia. She was born into slavery, and eventually, after the Civil War, her and her husband became landowners. She was not an artist in the same sense as the artists we've been looking at. She was primarily a wife and a mother who engaged in quilt making, which was certainly an acceptable vehicle for women's artistic expression for both white and Black American women. Quilt making is something that has a strong tradition in African American women's arts. The idea of going to a quilting bee was something that was a community event. Women would get together and work on quilts together. It was an opportunity to express themselves artistically, but also just build community. Quilts have existed for a long time in African American culture. They played a role in things like the Underground Railroad by coming up with symbolic patterns that would guide runaway slaves in the direction that they should go. They served as kind of markers for, like, this is a safe house. And in this case, we have the depiction of some events from the Bible and some events from Harriet Powers' everyday life. So we have very unified quilt overall in terms of repeated colors, some shapes. Some of the squares depict, like I mentioned, stories from the Bible. We've got Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the serpent tempting Eve, and then there's also one of the squares depicts an event with a runaway pig that would have happened in Harriet Powers' lifetime. So we've got that juxtaposition of Bible stuff and personalized stuff. This is only one of two quilts that is known for sure to be the work of Harriet Powers that exists today. This one is in Boston, and the other one is in Washington, D.C., I believe. So I think it's nice to kind of bring in not only artists from what we consider the canon, but also artists who are working in other medias as well. Okay, now we are moving into the birth of modern sculpture, and we are going to focus on Auguste Rodin. So we've got some of the most notable characteristics of modern painting, including a newfound realism of subject and technique, a more fluid or impressionistic handling of medium, and a new treatment of space. One 19th century sculptor, Auguste Rodin, changed the course of the history of sculpture by applying these principles of modern painting in his work in sculpture. And he devoted most of his life artistically to the representation of the human figure. And he is considered to be the father of modern sculpture. He didn't really set out to be a rebel in the sense that we think of with people, casting aside, the old ways. But Rodin very much depicted humans as they looked in real life, using live models and not idealizing people. And that was something that, a lot of people who were still following the academy and still interested in buying and commissioning art. They were interested in, beautiful landscapes and portraits of beautiful people looking beautiful. And Rodin was very much of the belief that, humans are not always beautiful, and we are not always pleasant, and we are not always idealized. Sometimes we're grumpy and angry, and we have imperfections in our face, and that is how he sculpted. And so that was sometimes to people's surprise, and he in that way really ushered in kind of the modern sculpture movement by taking all those new techniques for painting, as well as just depicting humans how they really are. This is the sculpture called the Bergers of Calais, and it really is an example of showing humans in kind of some of their worst times. This actually depicts a story from long before Rodin's time. It is the story of some Bergers, which are kind of like the elders of a town called Calais. So it's an event that happened in the Hundred Years' War, which happened in the 1300s. So Rodin's going way back, depicting a story. And the summary of the story is that Calais was surrounded by their enemies, and pretty much they were going to starve out the citizens of Calais. They weren't letting anyone in, they weren't letting anyone out. And the deal was, if you want us to leave the townspeople alone, if you want them to be spared, the elders must present themselves for sacrifice. So we have the elders presenting themselves with nooses around their necks, and this is very much depicting their psychological state. You have some people who are just kind of downcasting their head. There's one figure whose head is kind of, he's like holding his head with his hands. One of the figures who's holding, I think it's holding the key to the city, he's the one that's kind of like upright and like looking forward. So we've got this sculpture that is very much meant to be seen all the way around. You have to walk around the entire thing to really investigate all the different faces. So it's not really a cohesive group. It's not meant to be viewed from one particular vantage point. And when you approach it, you are not completely at eye level, but pretty close to eye level, so that you can really partake in this tragic emotion for them to be seen. This is just a detail of one of the hands on the sculptures. But as his career progressed, Rodin's sculptures took on more abstract qualities. He started to abandon specific features even more, and just kind of focus on solids and voids, like negative space. And this was new, moving more towards abstraction, which of course was unsettling for people who are not used to seeing that kind of thing. And so in this way, as we get to closer to the 20th century, we're going to see more and more of his influence on artists. Okay, so we have looked at a variety of styles in here, and we are finding ourselves now with the style called Art Nouveau, as we're moving from the 19th century into the 20th century. This was a style that started in Europe and kind of came over into the United States a little bit too. And what's cool about this style is that we see it from painting to sculpture, as well as architecture, furniture, jewelry, fashion, glassware. Art Nouveau is a style that kind of encompasses more than just kind of what we've been looking at with the traditional visual art. It really branched off into kind of everyday utilitarian objects as well. So Art Nouveau is marked by a lyrical linearity, the use of symbolism, rich ornamentation, and an overriding sense of the organic. Art Nouveau originated in England as part of the arts and crafts movement that arose in rebellion against the pretentiousness of 19th century art. As the 19th century was coming to a close. There had been a period of industrialization where things started to be highly manufactured, and the arts and crafts movement was a reaction to that, in the sense that, like, if you think about, in today's world, like, cheap manufactured furniture, and that maybe doesn't have high quality, that kind of same thing was happening in the 19th century. And so there were some artists that rebelled against that and said, we need to get back to handmade quality, beautiful objects that are, well crafted. Of course, that comes with an increase of cost, but that is what the Art Nouveau style comes out of that. And so this is an example of an interior of the Tassel House. The architect was Victor Horta, and he was one of the main Art Nouveau style purveyors. And so you can see, when we talk about the idea of lyrical linearity, look at the stair railing and how the rungs of the stairwell don't just go up and down. There have these really back and forth, beautiful, organic lines. So a lot of Art Nouveau comes from the idea of like plant growth. Think about like twisting and curling vines, plants kind of growing up. That is very much how the stair rungs go. And even on the wall, the decorations, some of the carving, it's all this very beautiful kind of like twisting and curving line work. And we also have that with the building in Barcelona, built by Antoni Gaudi. We've looked at his work before with the Parc Güell in Barcelona, and here is the exterior of an apartment building. And if you think about, how a lot of buildings are built, particularly apartment buildings, right? They just like a giant rectangle divided up into rectangles. And this one is certainly organic in the quality of like the rippling front of it, and all of the window shapes are rounded and curved, very organic. Even though this is made with stone and cement, it looks very wave-like and something, kind of naturally growing, versus, built with kind of steel cage construction, which you would, see in some other examples of architecture at this time. I just wanted to show you a couple of other examples of Art Nouveau. Alphonse Mucha was a two-dimensional artist, primarily working with like prints and paintings, and you see that same kind of line work, very linear quality. And then just another example of that Art Nouveau door frame with, it's just not simple straight up and down grates. It's kind of these all twisting and curving lines and things like that. So now we're going to move into the wider world, and I'm just showing you a little timeline of some other things happening in the wider world. We're going to look at some African art, some stuff from India and Oceania and Japan as well. So just important to remember that while we focus mostly on the Western world in this class, of course, there's other things happening all over the world. So we're going to start with some African art. And it was only in the 19th century that anthropologists and other scholars began to consider sculpture and other objects created by Africans as for commemorative or ritualistic purposes as art. Africans created, and still create today, sacred objects, among other reasons, to honor ancestors and rulers, to beseech and propagate spirits, and to serve as mediators between the living and the dead, and between humans and the powers beyond them. We could speak about African art a whole lot. I think it's important just to mention that the Western world's definitions of art don't necessarily always apply to the objects that have been created in other parts of the world, maybe in Africa and Oceania and other world and areas. Their concept of art is not necessarily the same as ours. And so it's really at the beginning of the 20th century and in the 19th century that the Western world looks at places like Africa and kind of starts deeming things as these are art objects. And so that's important to remember, that while we assign our Western definitions of art on these objects, the original intent behind them is not necessarily the same. It's also important to just be aware of some of the terms that were assigned to this artwork. A lot of times you may read descriptions of African art as primitive, and there's some negative connotations that go with that label being assigned to this artwork. And that was something that artists from the Western world were looking at African art and art from the rest of the world and getting some inspirations from it. And European museums were collecting objects from places like Africa, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. And that's just something that as we move forward, trying to re-examine these objects from the original perspective versus from our Western notions of primitive art, I think is really important. This figure is called an Nkisi Nkande, and it's from the Congo. And the function of this figure was protection from enemies or from something specific, possibly an illness or something like that. The idea is that if there was something awry in the community, something was wrong, perhaps an illness was going around, or perhaps, I don't know, someone's goat got stolen, the Nkisi Nkande would be commissioned, and this would be a way to kind of right the wrong. So within its center part is a cavity that would have been packed with medicinal objects like herbs or other plants that were considered to be medicinal or magical. And then all around the outside of this figure are nails, and the act of driving the nail into the figure is the act of activating it, is starting its power. And so people would be responsible for nailing a nail into the figure as a way to activate the power of this figure, but also as a way for them to say, like, I am not the person responsible for this illness. And so through the activation of the Nkisi Nkonde, the idea was that the right, whatever was wrong in the community, would be righted. Okay, and now we are going to look at this mother and child figure, which certainly throughout a Western world that we've looked at with art, we have seen some mother and child images. And so now we have a sculpture of the mother and child carved with wood. And in this particular one, it's from Yombe, which is the people in the Republic of Congo. It is a woman who has some body scarification across her chest area, but she's also wearing jewelry, and she's sitting cross-legged with an infant in her lap. And she is most likely representing an important maternal ancestor. So this would be a figure that, once again, would be used to honor ancestors and spirits by the people that had it commemorated, or had it commissioned, excuse me. Okay, and then here we have an ancestral couple. So once again, this idea of honoring ancestors. This is from the Dogon people in Mali, and it represents another common image in African art that we see representing ancestors. And while we do not know exactly why this particular one was created, we do have some genders depicted, so we can tell, the genders of the figure. The male has his arm around the female, kind of as if to protect her. And he also, you can't see it in this view of the photograph of the sculpture, but he has a quiver on his back, suggesting that he does, hunt for his family and provide for his family. The woman has a baby baby on her back. And so you don't have a very realistic depiction of humans, kind of these stylized, body part depictions in basic geometric forms. And that's going to be something that we see European and American artists are influenced by as we move forward. Throughout the 19th century, India remained under the hegemony of Britain, whose influence extended to the arts and architecture. And during the period of colonial rule, Indian art demonstrated the effects of hybridization, or the fusion of cultures and artistic styles. One good example of this hybridization or fusions of styles from East and West is the Victoria Terminus. It has now been renamed to honor the founder of the Maratha Empire. And this one shows a connection to 19th century kind of Gothic revival architecture, which was popular in Europe and the United States in the 19th century. There was some buildings built kind of like, let's get back to some of that Gothic style architecture. So in this case, we have a building. So this is a transport terminal, like for buses and trains and things like that. And so we've got some pointed arches and arcades and windows, some of that kind of cathedral style architecture that you might remember. We see some round windows as well. So kind of maybe makes you think of some of those Gothic cathedrals. But then also there are some domes and little minaret shapes that are similar to that Mughal architecture from India. Remember the Taj Mahal. So we really have this blending of East and West architectural styles. The outside of this building is also has some carvings of allegorical figures and animals and plants, like some of the other Indian architecture that we've seen. It's also built with sandstone, which was a local material that would have been used for building in this style. And then we're looking at a watercolor painting to show another example of European and Indian style. This is a portrait, and he was a local ruler of Jodhpur in Rajasthan, and it was painted in the late 1800s. So this pose kind of shows like refined and relaxed style, similar to some of the poses that we've seen in Western art. From just kind of like middle class portraits from the Western world. And of course, we have very Indian style of clothing and everything like that, because of course this person was Indian. So he's wearing his turban, he's got his curly beard, he's wearing clothing that is Indian. And this is a really small portrait painting it's similar to kind of the miniature painting that we've seen before from India. And we've got this nice, blending of kind of Western style, but also some things coming from India as well. Okay, now we're going to move to Japan. During the 19th century, the Edo period drew to a close and the Meiji period began. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor and demanded that Japan open trade with the West. For the next several decades, the Meiji emperors took measures to modernize Japan. And the opening of trade between Japan and the West led to Japanese prints flowing into Paris and other cities, as well as Japanese artists studying with Western artists in Japan and Europe. So now we come full circle to the Impressionists and getting access to those Japanese prints and being highly influenced by them. And this is certainly why. Okay, and here is a very famous woodblock print that you have probably seen before. This is by the artist Katsushika Hokusai, and the idea that keep in mind that this is a woodblock print. And so it's one of many that were produced. They were produced actually as souvenirs for domestic tourism. So this would have been something that was printed for Japanese people traveling around inside Japan, like a souvenir for visiting Mount Fuji. Hokusai was really interested in depicting Mount Fuji. He had kind of a fascination with the mountain. So he depicted 36 views. So this is from a series of 36 views of Mount Fuji. Sometimes Mount Fuji is really large and dominates the composition, and sometimes, like as in this case, the under the wave off Kanagawa, the mountain is small and in the background. So in this case, we've got this rogue wave that is reaching up and about to crash down on some little fishing boats, and kind of a dramatic scene with this active active canvas or it's not a canvas, excuse me, the active print where he is showing kind of nature's domination over humans. Ando Hiroshige was another well-known printmaker, and this is a good example of that kind of off-center composition that a lot of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were influenced by. And this particular print is actually copied by Vincent van Gogh, which I'll show you here just in a moment. So this is Vincent van Gogh's painting of that Hiroshige print. So he has added some things to it, like a little frame and some calligraphy. I'm not totally sure that Vincent van Gogh knew what he was painting with the calligraphy, but you can see very much so directly influenced by Japanese art. So there were some Japanese artists that studied with Western artists who were living in Japan, and some Japanese artists visited cultural centers in Europe. And so this is a painting by Takahashi Yuichi, and he is depicting an idealized Japanese woman, and it's very much in a 19th century Western European kind of style. This portrait was painted in 1872, and it's about it's about a little bit after the time that Edward Manet is doing Olympia in his painting, just to kind of give you a sense of about the about how things are lining up. So I kind of see some influence kind of going the other way. Okay, and now we're moving over to the arts of Oceania. So the cultures of Oceania go back centuries, although the West's consciousness of them only goes back as far as the early 1500s when European explorers kind of had contact with them. The territory now known as Oceania includes the islands of Micronesia, Melanesia, Malaysia, and Polynesia, which includes New Zealand. So here is Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. The canoe in the people of Oceania was a means of transportation and communication, and they often would fit the prows of their vessels with these fearsome looking figures. So we're not looking at the entire canoe. This is just the part that would have been stuck on the front of it. And the idea was to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies and what they believed to be the ominous spirits of the seas. So this canoe prow was carved by the Polynesian Maori people of New Zealand. And so once again, this is something that would not have necessarily been considered art in their culture in the same way that we consider a sculpture to be art, but it certainly has some artistic qualities. Some of the patterns that are carved into the wood are similar to the body art of the people from that culture. So this is a watercolor of an indigenous person by a non-indigenous person, but I'm just showing you the tattooing and the patterns and how those are reflective in some of their sculpture and carving. So you may be a little bit more familiar with areas of the Papua New Guinea and West Papua and Papua, and those areas are now part of Indonesia. And these are some carved wooden poles by the Asmat people of Papua who inhabit the southwest coastal region of the island. And these poles are carved figures stacked one on top of each other, and they have some open areas as well, some negative spaces, and they are carved from a single mangrove tree. And the points would have been shoved into the ground, and it was they are these particular ones would have been from the mid 20th century. And these are related to a once common practice of headhunting to avenge the death of community men by enemies. And this practice ended, it ended in the 1960s. Okay, and then we'll wrap up Oceania with this ancestral figure. So this is a Yuli figure from Papua New Ireland, and it represents an ancestral ruler, and it was used in rituals to help to transition the soul from the earthly realm into the realm of the dead. So as the Uli statue kind of presided over this transition, and so they would have been used in those rituals. This particular sculpture is somewhat androgynous. It has male genitals and women's breasts. And so, in terms of stereotypical gender rules, this one kind of is both a warrior and a nurturer in this case. So, we're just kind of connecting some of those traditional arts to what's going on at the same time as what's happening in the Western world. And now we're going to jump back over into the Americas. So during the 19th century, the Americas, including the American Southwest and the Great Plains, as well as Central America and the Caribbean, continued to be impacted by European contact, conquest, and colonialism. The Native Americans of the Great Plains, living in a nomadic existence after their communities were destroyed by settlers, created nature and war paintings on buffalo hides. In Mexico, the shackles of Spanish rule were broken, and although the nation won independence, it entered a period of disarray that ended only with the radical reforms under the leadership of Benito Juarez. And the arrival of European explorers into the northwest coastal regions of North America did not have the same impact as in other areas, and the native traditions and the art forms continued. This is a teepee lining painted on muslin, and it's from the Crow people of the Sioux Nation. And this depicts the deadly combat between the Native Americans and the U.S. cavalry under the leadership of General George Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn. And it was during the Great Sioux War of 1878. Custer's forces are depicted as mostly dismounted, like not on their horses anymore, or dead, and they're met on the battlefield by superior opponents who advance from the right, shooting arrows as they ride. And so we do find, because there was connection between Native Americans and the colonial powers, some influence from European artistic styles as the contact grows. This artwork from Mexico is more about how our art can certainly reflect the social and political events that are happening under this time. So while Mexico became an independent nation, it did lose a lot of its territory from Texas to California, and it had some intervention from the French. and that forced Juarez into exile and established a very kind of brief second Mexican empire with an Austrian guy, Ferdinand Maximilian, appointed as the emperor by France's Napoleon III. So Maximilian and his loyalist Mexican forces would eventually fall just a handful of years later, 1867, and then he was executed by a firing squad by Juarez's order. So that is the depiction of this artwork. And so it's really important to recognize the fact that art often imitates what's happening, and that's something that we're going to see a lot in moving forward with some Mexican art. We've got some simple shapes, bright flat colors, and that's going to become a similar characteristic style in the work of Mexican muralists as we move into the 20th century. And lastly, we're going to end with the Northwest Native Americans. So think Northern California, Washington State, Oregon, on up into Alaska area, British Columbia, Vancouver. Certainly there was contact between European explorers and the indigenous people, and it wasn't always, bright, sunny, and positive. But a lot of that indigenous population remained isolated during the 19th century. And so some of their traditions and art forms were less affected. And so the Inuit people depict some sculptures that show simplicity with how they depict the human form. We've got a sometimes called Eskimo mask, but nowadays we use the word Inuit more commonly. This is representing a moon goddess, and this is a mask that would have been worn by a shaman in a ritual ceremony. A lot of times these are carved from wood or sometimes from ivory, and often had movable parts to them as they wore them. And of course, there was more to this. The mask would have had a costume with it. There would have been music and possibly dancing and movement that went with it as well. And now we have a carved wood and muslin mask by the Kwakawak people. And this represents the sun and some other spirits that are vividly painted. We've got some very abstract forms just because they're kind of simplified shapes and just bright, flat colors. This mask would have also had some movable parts that went with it. And whenever we look at masks, we want to remember that, while we are looking at them hung on the wall in a museum, they would have had a much different purpose. They would have been worn by a human who was wearing some sort of costume. There would have been a much larger, what we call masquerade to it. It would have included music and costuming and performing and people watching and participating. And so this is something that we want to make sure we're remembering, is that we are looking at them in a very isolated case, but certainly it would have been, used in a very special circumstance in their culture. And that is going to wrap up this lecture.